Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 34th meeting in 2024 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have one item on the agenda and that is an evidence session with the Institute for Fiscal Studies in relation to the UK Economic and Fiscal Outlook to inform our scrutiny of the Scottish Budget 25-26. We are joined remotely by David Phillips and Ben Zaranko, who are both Associate Directors at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I'd like to welcome you both to the meeting. We'll move straight to questions. So I'd like to start the session by, first of all, just asking for a brief explanation. I think we all know it, but for the record, of SCAPE, because you use the word SCAPE, the acronym SCAPE, throughout your analysis of the Scottish Budget. And my understanding is it means superannuation contributions adjusted for past experience, which is no wonder why you use the acronym. So I'm just wondering if you can explain exactly what that means.
Should I take that one, David?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having us. And thank you in particular for facilitating this remotely. It's much appreciated to fit with other commitments. SCAPE is a horrible, it's a horrible set of words. It's a real mouthful. So yeah, we do stick to the acronym. I'll start with the sort of technical definition then, and I'll zoom out and explain it in simple terms. It's the discount rate used by the Treasury to set pension contributions for public sector employers. So it's based on an assumption about the long-term growth rate in GDP, which is the discount rate the Treasury thinks about how to trade off spending in the future versus today, thinking about the fact that we expect taxes to broadly grow in line with GDP. And so it sort of tells us about how much you need to contribute today in order to finance a future spending commitment. So when you're thinking about a public sector hospital or school making a contribution to a pension on behalf of their employees, it's the SCAPE rate is what the Treasury uses to calculate how much that hospital or school should be sending back to the Treasury to reflect the future pension promise for their members. Now that the SCAPE rate has moved over time, it's come down over time as our estimates for how much future economic growth we'll get have come down, which means it's become more expensive to provide public sector pensions. So a hospital or a school now has to send back to the Treasury a bigger percentage of each person's pay bill with respect to their pension because of that reduction in the SCAPE rate. I'll stop there, but it's a really technical concept, but it's about trying to align incentives between the centre and the employers of public sector workers.
Okay, and just to follow that on, I just wonder if you can explain what you believe that the impact of that will be on the Scottish budget next year.
So
go on, David.
Yeah, so we've not looked at next year's figures yet for the Scottish budget. What we've looked at is the amount of funding that came through in the main estimates, and then an assumption about how much might come through in the autumn budget in the current financial year. So to what extent is part of the additional funding this year received since the Scottish budget was initially made back in December last year, what proportion of that actually is not really additional revenues and funding to spend, but is to account for these additional SCAPE costs. And in doing that, across the UK as a whole, about 80% of the SCAPE costs came in the main estimates, with about 20% still to come in the budget. And then we've made that same assumption in the absence of information. We made that same assumption for Scotland, that 80% is the sort of itemised bits of SCAPE funding that came through in the main estimates for the Scottish Government. But there's an amount, about 20% more, still to come through in the budget from October. But of course, that wasn't itemised. That's just an assumption on our part. And altogether, that's around just over £400 million of SCAPE costs. We've not looked at that specifically for Scotland next year, but my estimate would be it would be a broadly similar amount, unless Ben has got alternative information.
Okay. Digging deeper into your analysis, you've said that the Scottish Government looks set to continue to face tough trade-offs in future years. Carrying forward funding would ease trade-offs between services next year, but such funding can only be used once will only help the budgetary pressures facing the Scottish Government in later years if it is successfully utilised to help boost productivity, address the drivers of service demand or boost economic performance and hence tax revenue. And you go on to say, even if successful, such efforts may take several years to bear fruit, meaning without further top-ups to UK spending plans or increases in Scottish taxes, some services will likely face cuts in future years. I mean, that's a wee bit more pessimistic than other commentators have suggested.
Yeah, so the reason we've said that is there's no doubt that the UK budget and then some of the top-ups the Scottish Government has made in the autumn budget revision through underspends last year and plans to draw down more of ScotWind, together that Scottish funding and the additional funding through the UK budget in October has transformed, in a good way, the short-term funding outlook for the Scottish Government. So back in the original budget plans 24-25, the amount spent on public services under those plans, after accounting for inflation, would be 0.6% lower in real terms than the amount actually spent last year. Now, when you account for the changes that the Scottish Government made in the autumn budget revision, that pushes it to about a 2% increase, so an increase rather than a cut. And then if you account also for the money coming from the UK budget, a close to 6% increase real terms in amount able to spend on public services this year compared to last year, if all the funding was used in the current year. Now, if that was the case, given the amount available next year from the UK Government, given that you couldn't also draw down the ScotWind revenues and the reserves twice, given that we now expect perhaps the income tax net position next year to be perhaps not quite as strong as was forecast by the SFC back in December last year, taking all that together, if you spent all that additional funding this year, carried none of it forward, the increase in funding next year would only be around 0.5 to 1% in real terms. That is still an increase, but is a substantially slower rate of increase than this year, and is the kind of rate of increase that if you wanted to increase the NHS, say, by 2 to 3%, that could mean cuts to other services. Then, of course, down the line in the 26-27 onwards, the UK Government has penciled in obviously a very front-loaded increase in funding, and therefore subsequent increases, whilst you don't know the exact amount the Scottish Government would get because it's not allocated it between UK Government departments yet, the 1.3% overall real terms increases in resource spending penciled in each year, we've sort of run some scenarios on that on the basis of, well, if the UK Government follows what we think the NHS might need, its childcare commitments, aid and overseas commitments, passing that through the Barnett formula, and then also looking at what might be happening to Scottish tax revenues and so on. And we think that increases could be about 0.7% a year on average, real terms, for day-to-day spending for the Scottish Government from 26 to 29. And again, that's a sort of increase that would, if you were to increase health even by just 2% a year, which is quite a bit slower than its long-run growth, that would require small cuts on average to other areas. Increasing NHS by, say, 3.5% a year, more in line with its long-run average, would require quite substantial cuts to other services. And that's why we've said that unless either this front-loaded spending allows you to really boost productivity or to really substantially boost Scottish tax revenues, and actually because of the fiscal framework, it's not just boosting Scottish revenues, but boosting them more than revenues in the rest of the UK. Unless you can do that, unless there's increases in funding from the UK Government or substantial Scottish tax rises, the challenges, certainly in the second half of this decade, are really difficult. Next year crucially depends on whether or not some of this funding from this year, I said, which allows a 6% real terms increase if it's all spent, if some of that's carried forward into next year, that can ease the pressure in the short term, but it doesn't really kind of reduce those trade-offs in the longer term.
Okay, thank you for that. I think you basically said that and a quote from your own document here, as with funding in 24-25, part of the increase in resource funding reflects extra scape costs rather than an increase in spending power. So you've talked about how the budget in real terms is increasing fairly modestly, but that also means that the Scottish Government has to be very careful about how it actually spends its money. And you go on to talk about behavioural response in relation to income tax, because you did talk about tax revenues there as well, and you said that SFC findings are that such responses in terms of behaviour will offset half of revenues from the Scottish 45% rate and 85% from Scotland's top rate of tax, and you talk about the need to evaluate the impact of those more, and you go on to talk about the complexity introduced by having 19%, 20% and 21%, suggesting that's particularly unwarranted. So where do you feel that the Scottish Government is in terms of this issue of taxation and behavioural responses at this time? And because you go on to say that the Scottish Government should be open to reversing course if new evidence again suggests bigger than expected behavioural impacts, and that a strategy should be open to revision, not set in stone.
Yes, so I think you're referring to our paper we put out a couple of weeks ago looking at the evidence on Scotland's income tax changes. But I think I can kind of say up front that overall we think that the Scottish income tax changes have raised revenue and a fairly substantial amount of revenue for the Scottish Government's budget. But that is largely because of the lower higher rate threshold, the increase in the higher rate tax, the increase in introduction of the advanced rate, although as you mentioned the SFC estimate that around, or I should say assume around half of that revenue will be lost as a result of behavioural response. But looking at the evidence, the top rate of income tax, that which applies to those above £125,000 a year approximately now, evidence both internationally and the limited amount of evidence we have from Scotland suggests that this group of taxpayers is particularly responsive. Now, as I said, the SFC estimate that the amount of response they can do through a combination of evasion avoidance, maybe some changes in the labour supply, migration decisions, altogether those things offset around 85% of the mechanical revenue you get just through the sort of higher tax rate. Evidence internationally is sort of broadly consistent with that, but there's a big range. The only evidence we really have from Scotland specifically are two studies undertaken by HMRC using the initial changes to Scotland's income tax rates back in 2018-19. If anything, that suggests the behaviour responses were even larger than the SFC estimated or was assumed, and actually enough that that top rate specifically, those increases might have actually reduced revenue slightly rather than increased revenue slightly. But we do emphasise there's a lot of uncertainty around this. And of course, since those initial changes in 2019, there have been subsequent changes in 23-24 and 24-25, which are much, much bigger. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, actually, those bigger changes makes it even more worthwhile engaging in the costs and the hassle of changing your behaviour. So you might expect an even bigger response to those. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, people have already adjusted their affairs, and therefore the extra marginal effect of these new changes might be smaller. And that's why we said the Scottish Government really should evaluate, working with HMRC to evaluate these newer changes to taxes, which have really opened up the wedge for these higher earners in Scotland. Because the evidence at the moment for Scotland itself is pretty limited. We can learn more from these more recent changes. And we said that in the meantime, given that the evidence is that actually responses are large and perhaps even a little bit larger than the SFC had assumed going into the policy changes, it might make sense to hold off making further changes, certainly in an upwards direction, until you have more evidence about what the scale of the effects are. And then the tax strategy is an opportunity both to set out plans to that evaluation, but also to see tax in its wider context. Because if the Scottish Government wants to continue to raise additional revenue and do so in a progressive way, it's not just income tax is the only tool available to it. Property taxes are there as well. And for example, council tax has been on its to-do list and actually with a sort of commitment to look at this for quite a long time. And that is a tax where you could raise more from higher earners and higher wealth individuals and isn't subject to the same degree of behavioural response. It's harder to move and hide a property than it is to move an individual, and certainly to move their income and hide their income.
Okay, I mean, one of the issues that's talked about, and I'll stick to tax in a minute, is about the coherence of the tax strategy. So in terms of the UK tax system, IFS Director Paul Johnson said that if this government really wants to focus on growth, then part of the plan needs to be a much more coherent tax strategy than we saw in the 2024 budget. So can you explain what the IFS believes should be a more coherent strategy, and how we in Scotland, because obviously a lot of our tax strategy is dependent on what happens UK-wide, how we can build on that?
Ben, have you got any comments first, or shall I go on to this one?
I'm happy to start. I think that the frustration that Paul Johnson felt around the budget was that the government's tax announcements felt largely governed by what they felt may or may not be consistent with a particular line in the manifesto, rather than any sort of economic or even fiscal strategy about what they're trying to achieve through it. And I think the sympathetic view is that in a relatively short space of time since the UK general election, hadn't come up with plans for that, though they did have a long stint in opposition. But I think that if you're serious about trying to jolt the UK out of its sort of growth slump, I think that tax clearly isn't the only thing that matters. It's maybe not even top 3, maybe not even top 5, but it clearly should be on the list of things that you are thinking about and how you can make changes that make it more growth friendly. I think some of the obvious examples might be around things like, well, the obvious will be stamp duty, things that hamper mobility and ability of people to move where the jobs are, and the allocation of housing becomes more inefficient. You could talk about the design of taxes on work and the sort of incoherence of having a national insurance and an income tax system alongside each other. Some of the peculiar incentives it creates of people, either people having their benefits withdrawn who face extremely high marginal tax rates, people who have face very high marginal tax rates when things like child benefit are withdrawn, or when their personal tax allowance is withdrawn, and some of the perverse incentives that can create. And lots of other things besides, but you're on corporation tax and some of the incentives you create for companies to invest in certain things and not others, and how they finance themselves. So there's a whole litany of things you could look at. And I think that what we'd have liked to have seen is at least, even if not all the answers, at least a willingness to engage in consultations or thinking about the questions or evidence gathering, or a direction of travel even would have been appreciated. I think that was what was lacking.
Yes, if I may come in there as well. So I think, there are many issues with the tax system, as Ben said. And, when you've got a new government with a large majority and a sort of, a very clearly stated ambition for growth and making difficult decisions to get growth, I think it was disappointing not to see a more coherent strategy and tackling some of those inefficiencies in the tax system which distort behaviour, but have got, if you like, interest groups sort of built around them. Now, we did see some changes, obviously, to inheritance tax, which actually, although very controversial, probably move it a little bit in the right direction, in the sense that it doesn't, it will distort a little bit less how people decide to hold their assets by reducing the benefit of holding assets, in family businesses or in agricultural land to avoid tax. But actually, on some of the big issues, the two big areas of tax which are really quite distortive are, A, the way we tax different forms of remuneration really quite differently. So you're taxed quite a lot less if you take your income in dividends than if you take it as a self-employed person, and then if you take it as an employee. And that distorts the sort of production of the economy. So there's, more small businesses and self-employed people than there would be in the absence of these tax distortions, and fewer people in larger employers. And by increasing employers' national insurance, and also then by increasing the small business allowance in that, the government actually increased those distortions. So further encouraging, small incorporated businesses, self-employment over employee forms of working. And given evidence is that actually these employee forms tend to be associated with higher productivity, the tax system is sort of encouraging, if you like, on average, lower productivity activities than higher productivity activities. Now, obviously, that is, requires looking at capital gains tax, income tax, national insurance, dividends tax. Only a small part of that is devolved to Scotland. One of the reasons we've said actually devolving dividends and savings income tax to Scotland might make sense is to allow it to align that with its own tax rates to avoid, further increasing the distortions towards incorporation. So you're right that actually the Scottish Government only has, a small part of the tax powers and can't tackle all these problems on its own. The other kind of really big issue, I think, is around the taxation of property, which Ben mentioned there. Scotland here does have a lot of the key powers. It's got land and building transactions tax, it's got council tax, it's got business rates. At a UK level and at a Scottish level, unfortunately, the last 10 years or so has seen us move in the wrong direction with property taxes by increasing the transactions tax and in particular increasing it on second homes and rental properties. So distorting, again, how the property market's working, and actually by increasing the overall tax wedge, making moving more expensive, both making it harder for people to kind of get into the house they want, but also harder to take the jobs they want. And I think actually an ambitious tax strategy in Scotland would set out some plans for property taxes, where a lot of the powers already are devolved, on how that can be made more growth friendly and actually more fair to people that need to move around due to changes in their circumstances.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you mentioned there incorporation, and the OBR said that incorporation across the UK was likely to encourage about 17,000 incorporations, costing about 0.7 billion in revenue. I'm just wondering if incorporation, if you've seen higher rates of incorporation in relative terms in Scotland because of recent tax changes than the rest of the UK, or if there's no real difference, or if indeed you don't have the data as yet to assess that.
We've not looked at this issue yet. I actually eyeballed the figures a little while ago about, you can get the kind of number of incorporated businesses. I eyeballed the figures. And just from that, I couldn't see, in aggregate, much of an effect in Scotland. But that was just eyeballing. What we'd really want to see is an analysis a little bit like what HMRC has done for labour supply and migration and participation, to look at the incorporation margin. So looking at those groups that have seen differential changes in their incentives to incorporate given Scotland's income tax changes. Now, I might not have expected much back in 2018-19, given the size of the tax differences at that point. I might expect there to be more of an impact. Now we've got, for example, someone on 125,000, the tax wedge is now about £5,200 additional under Scotland's income tax. Might think there'd be more of an effect now. So I think when the data for 23, 24, and certainly 24, 25 starts coming through, 23, 24 should be coming through next year, and 24, 25 the year after, we should really kind of look at that issue then. So I think actually putting a request into HMRC to extend its analysis to incorporation would be a really useful thing to do.
Now, Paul Johnson, in his assessment of the UK budget, talked about the most striking aspect of the spending decisions, how incredibly front-loaded the additional spending is, and you've touched on that to some extent, and you said it'd be odd to increase spending rapidly only to start cutting back again in subsequent years. And when it comes to settling with departments for the period after 25-26, keeping within that 1.3% envelope will be extremely challenging. And he described that as a big gamble. How much of a gamble is it? I mean, is there any way you can assess how likely it is, you think, the government is able to reach its goals? Because the word, it's a big gamble, it doesn't really quantify it in any degree. I'm just wondering if you can help us with that.
I can certainly try. I think there's two ways to think about the front loading on the day-to-day spending side, which is, one is that it's about dealing with temporary pressures and temporary issues in public services, where things like resolving pay disputes or trying to inject funding in a bid to get through some of the backlogs that have emerged across different bits of public services And so you spend money now, you try and relieve those pressures, and then it becomes more realistic to have much more modest funding growth after that. That's one way of thinking about it, and that's, the gamble there is that you might inject that funding and it doesn't resolve any of the pressures, and they come back asking for more. And the other way to view it is that this is part of a negotiation, and the Treasury will pencil in tough spending numbers because it's arguing with different departments, with the Ministry of Defence, with the Ministry of Justice, with the NHS about how much they should get. And you start low, you lowball, and then you adjust over time as it seems to happen. Historical experience suggests that when the Treasury gets around to actually allocating to particular departments, it decides it wants to spend a bit more overall. And we did look, if you assume history repeats itself and you look at the sorts of increases you might expect, you'd be looking at, I think the OBR have looked at this and we looked at this, you'd be looking at about 20 billion ballpark extra spending by 2028, 29. And so depending on the composition of that will depend on how much goes to Scotland, but some non-trivial amount you'd expect to flow through. But of course, it depends. Rachel Reeves has been very clear in interviews since that she wants public services to live within their means. She intends to not come back with another package of big tax rises, and she intends to stick to these numbers. Now, of course, that is what she would say if she was embroiled in tough negotiations. But if you take her at her word, the UK government plans to stick to these. So I think a lot then hinges on, can that additional funding be translated into service improvements through reforms and so on, and how quickly. That's the judgment the government seems to be making.
And very briefly, I may, one of the kind of key issues in sort of this first way of seeing it, as Ben said, this hope that actually by putting a substantial investment in the short term can help address those backlogs and help kind of set things up for the future. Related to that is, can it help get productivity back up? Because one of the things we've seen in a number of public services, particularly the health service, is a decline, at least in measured productivity. So that, the number of doctors and nurses is up substantially, the amount of funding is up substantially. Now, in England, activity is up a bit in the health service, but not up as anywhere near as much as the number of inputs going into it. In Scotland, the inputs haven't gone up quite so much, and therefore activity is still actually a bit down on where it was in 2019-20 before the pandemic. And I think one of the real challenges actually when thinking about public finances going forward is, can we actually get, at least over the space of a few years, productivity in public services, especially NHS, to increase back up towards and perhaps above its 2019-20 levels? Without that increase, it has become more challenging going forwards, and that gamble is sort of a gamble that would look likely that you'll lose if you can't do that.
I think my colleagues will explore this in more details. I've just got a couple of more questions I want to ask. The first one is, the OBR have suggested that the Chancellor's headroom is only 0.3%, over the forecast period, which they think is extremely tight. How does the IFS feel about that?
So, but just to clarify, that 0.3% is how much the interest rate could go up, I think, and still meet the rules.
I can't remember the 0.3% number, but
it's 0.3% of our expenditure targets, so it's about £10 billion.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I thought it was. I thought reading the evidence, it was a 0.3% increase in the interest rate. Would.
So it's a cash headroom, £9.9 billion.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that it's clearly a very fine degree of space against those fiscal targets. I think it's almost, calling it 9.9 billion is almost spuriously precise given the number of moving parts in these forecasts and how uncertain it all is. I think that the way that I think about it is it's almost on a knife edge. It's quite close to 50-50 in a way whether those targets will be met. And I think that it's partly a function of how difficult the current fiscal dynamics are and how difficult a fiscal inheritance the UK government has had, that even only just meeting those targets is requiring some really quite painful choices on tax and spend, and borrowing more than they might have liked. And I think that the danger is that you end up in a world where if you've got a very small margin against a very uncertain forecast for where borrowing or where debt will be in 4 or 5 years, when the forecasts inevitably move, you have policy sort of overcorrecting and following that. So if the forecast moves slightly against you, you end up announcing more tax rises or spending cuts. Or if the forecast improves somewhat, the government goes, great, we can spend money and we can spend every penny of that additional so-called headroom. And I think it adds to policy volatility, it impedes ability to plan. And so I think that if you are serious about wanting to have debt falling, or if you're serious about wanting to run a current budget surplus, you might aim to meet it by a greater degree of a greater margin, though of course that entails other, more tax rises or spending cuts in the short term. So it's clearly politically difficult. But I think that maintaining a very fine degree of headroom against targets and seeking to almost meet them exactly doesn't lend itself to sensible policy making.
Okay, yeah, I think there'll be, I suggest there's a 54% chance of meeting the target, which is more or less the 50-50 that you suggested. Just last question from me, it's regarding, again, a quote from your Scottish analysis. You said, an increase in forecast whole economy inflation since the budget from 1.7% to 2.4% means that capital funding this year is little change in real terms compared to what was expected at the time of the Scottish budget, in stark contrast to the situation in resource funding. So what does that mean in terms of not just capital projects going forward, but the likely impact on productivity?
So, yes, I'll come in on first and I might hand over to Ben to talk about capital and productivity. So on the first point, there has been a small cash terms increase in the amount of funding available for capital this year compared to the initial budget. Basically, there were underspends on capital last year, which have been carried forward. And even with cancelling the planned resource to capital switch, when you combine that with some additional UK funding, slightly higher city deals funding, for example, the total amount of capital is up in cash terms this year. But because inflation is now going to be higher this year than at the start of the year, that actually doesn't translate much more into real terms. The key question actually for capital will be not actually what overall economy inflation has been, but the actual cost drivers for capital projects, so construction costs and construction materials and so on, and also equipment and things like that for sort of non-buildings variety of capital spending. I've not looked at what those cost drivers are. It would not surprise me if they have been outpacing economy-wide inflation. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, I think...
I'm going to...
Sorry.
Sorry? Ben, were you going to come in there, no?
I was going to add something very quickly, if I may.
Sure. Yeah.
So just on the productivity question, which you also asked, it really depends on what it's going on. I think that there's a tendency sometimes to equate capital investment with, good spending or productivity enhancing spending or growth enhancing spending, when I think we need to think more about the composition. So if you are building a new prison to enhance living standards and conditions for prisoners, that may well be a very valuable thing to do for us as a society. It's probably unlikely to be boosting our productive potential relative to investing in roads or railways or digital infrastructure or something else that enables, the private sector, for example, to become more productive. So I think that it really depends what it goes on. And a simple model of more capital investment equals more growth probably won't hold up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open up the session now, and the first colleague to ask questions will be Liz, to be followed by John.
Good morning. I would like to concentrate on the labour market, if I may, and particularly on economic inactivity, which, as you well know, is a huge issue just now. And I particularly want to focus on the report that the Centre for Social Justice did earlier in this year, where it's flagging up that 1 in 5 of those who are classified in Scotland as economically inactive are actually wanting to work, but are finding it very difficult to get into the labour market for various problems. I just want to ask, in your research, do you have good quality analysis on where it is within the labour market that we have the sticking points for those who want to work, but who are unable to get into work?
So I should say that this is not my specific area of expertise in the IFS's huge range of different areas of work. What I will say is that when we've looked at issues around economic inactivity, one of the factors that's been raised a lot is the increase in ill health. And after some analysis we've done of the transitions between employment and inactivity suggests a lot of the rise in ill health has been amongst those out of work already for a significant amount of time, and amongst those just leaving the labour market, actually quite a lot of the impact has been amongst those moving in towards retirement or other forms of inactivity. So we think the kind of story around ill health and inactivity is a little bit more complicated than is sometimes suggested. When it comes to those sort of accessing employment that, currently are inactive, they're not actively looking for work, but they would like work if it was available, there could be several factors involved. One could be the state of their health, and they feel that actually the jobs that are available are not compatible with their health conditions if they're inactive because of health reasons. It could be because of a sort of a mismatch of their skills between the skills that they have and the skills that are required by the labour market. It could also be related to issues in terms of the support that's required. So if you are, for example, on disability benefits, the sort of degree to which you are required to seek work is pretty limited. And if you've been out of the labour market for a long time, it might be quite hard for you to find work in that situation. Whereas if you are in sort of job seekers allowance type benefits, you're in sort of conditionality in terms of work, you're required to basically look for work pretty much full time. Not necessarily going to be particularly high quality work search effort, but that additional effort might be expected to lead you more into finding jobs. So what I'd say is there's probably several factors related to their skills, their health, the skills and sort of health requirements of the jobs, and then also the way the benefit system interacts with the sort of incentives that people face given the conditionality involved with different benefits.
Is it not the case, however, that there is a difference between those who are currently within the economic inactivity group, who are actually wanting to work, but are finding it very difficult to get into the labour market, and those who are not really bothered, to be quite honest? And therefore, if we are attracting people back into the labour market, are there, in your opinion, different policies that we need to be pursuing for these two different categories of people? So
to the extent to which there are subsets of people that are currently inactive, those that are not incentivised at all to seek work, those that are wanting to work but finding it difficult, you would expect a regime to have a combination of, if you like, carrots and sticks to address work incentive effects. So on the one hand, you'd expect there to be elements of sort of, targeted support for those that face particular challenges in terms of getting back into the labour market. So support with developing skills, support with confidence, support with understanding and how to apply for jobs, intense, if you like, sort of workfare type interventions. But actually many regimes do have sort of conditionality attached that require to kind of search for work. And then if you do not make those efforts, you can face sanctions in particular. Now, those sanction regimes differ quite significantly between whether you're in job seekers allowance type benefits or if you're in disability benefits. Now, one potential approach would be, if you like, to blur that line somewhat so that there's less of a sort of discontinuity depending on what type of benefit effectively you're on. I think that was the intention with the various types of employment support allowance, where you could be sort of in the support group, the work-related activity group, and you faced different types of interventions and conditionalities with that. I think, looking at that part of the system again to see, are we actually having that, if you like, continuum rather than sort of a dichotomy, I think would be an important thing to do.
Thank you. A helpful answer. But, in terms of being an institute that does so much for economic analysis, do you feel that the UK has sufficient data to drill down on this economic inactivity, because it is a major factor in policy making. If we could solve some of the economic inactivity issues, then not only would we be increasing revenue and increasing productivity in the economy, but it strikes me, and I think I could speak on behalf of another committee in this Parliament, where the data is seen to be vague and not really terribly helpful. Do you feel that's the case across the UK, that we don't have enough data on this?
So certainly the survey-based data, so the labour force survey, has known to be becoming increasingly poor at actually picking up the trends in what's happening both in employment, inactivity, and the sort of factors leading to it. But I said colleagues look not just at, if you like, the change in the level of inactivity and what was causing that, but also the transitions between employment and inactivity, and doing that transitions-based analysis as opposed to the levels-based analysis came to some quite different conclusions about what was going on in terms of underlying those trends in inactivity. That suggests that actually, the sort of data quality there is, if you like, lacking a little bit. And I'm also aware that if you look at, for example, figures on employment coming out of the LFS, and you compare that to what comes out of HMRC's real-time information employment, you get quite different figures there. Again, echoing a little bit what I think the OBR said in their evidence last week, there is clear data on applications to benefits for particularly health-related issues. They've increased substantially. They've increased more than in other countries. Actually, many countries, rates of claims for incapacity and disability benefit type benefits are lower now than they were pre-pandemic. The UK does stand out there, but as the OBR has said, it is difficult to kind of distinguish between to what extent is this a health shock, to what extent is this actually a different economic situation in the UK, and to what extent is this the incentives under the benefit system. Now, we don't have the answers here at the moment, but I know colleagues are planning research looking at this issue. What are the factors driving this increase in disability benefit-related economic inactivity? It's a difficult question to get at, but there is research underway at IFS on that, just not ready to report at this stage.
Yes, thank you. We had the OBR giving evidence to us just last week, so that came through. Can I ask you, in terms of our comparison UK-wide to other countries, we do seem to have higher rates of economic inactivity. Everybody had COVID, but we seem to be a bit of an outlier in this. Do you have any reflections as to why that is?
As I said, we've looked at the evidence and yes, whereas most European countries and the United States now have higher labour force participation than before COVID, the UK has lower labour force participation. And to some extent, that could be an artefact of this sort of decline in the quality of the LFS. And if, for example, as the quality has declined and response rates have declined, it's become a little bit more selected towards those that are at home, say, and therefore more likely to be inactive. That could be part of the story. But the claims for disability benefits clearly point, that there is something kind of, if you like, real going on here, just whether that is an issue of health or that's an issue of, if you like, ability to claim benefits or incentives to claim benefits because of, say, the cost of living crisis is less clear. Now, one thing I will note here is that in part of a work on Scotland's disability benefits, which were designed to make it easier to claim, were designed to make it less likely that you'd be booted out after a short period by making the kind of reassessments regime a little bit less stringent. What we've noticed actually somewhat under the radar, similar things happening to the UK. So the number of appointments that are now in person has plummeted. They're mostly done, over the phone. The number of reassessments being undertaken is plummeted. And so these factors that have, if you like, reduced the hassle of applying for disability benefits and then made it less likely that you'll leave disability benefits once you're on it, that could be a factor in explaining the increase in disability benefit claims UK-wide. For Scotland, given this is happening UK-wide, not just in Scotland, actually it might be a slight benefit to the budget because it might mean the Scottish benefit changes don't cost as much more than the UK-wide system. But of course, for the UK as a whole, it's a really big challenge for our public finances.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. John, followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, Convener. If we can start with maybe national insurance and the employers' increase in contributions. You say in your reports currently unclear whether the Scottish Government's share of compensation will be based on the Barnett formula or on its higher share, population share of the public sector wage bill. Now, we seem to be a little bit clearer now. I don't know if you're clearer now as to what's actually happening. But it seems that under either formula, we're not getting the full amount of national insurance. Is that a correct understanding?
So since we wrote this report, there's been sort of, if you like, unconfirmed information from the UK government that the amount the Scottish Government could receive would be just over £300 million approximately. That would appear to be consistent with actually, well, a little bit less than the Barnett share would look like to me, but perhaps it's because slightly higher shares going to non-Barnettable services like the Ministry of Defence and, FCDO and things than I would assumed. But the figures being talked about, £300 million coming down the line, would be more consistent with a Barnett formula population-based share as opposed to a share based on Scotland's larger public sector and higher public sector wages. The Scottish Government, using information collated from various departments, come up with a figure, I think, around £550 million. The Fraser Allender Institute came up with a figure a little bit lower than that, I think, but again, £500 to £550 million. Now, what I would suggest is that if the UK government does provide £300 to £350 million, the cost for the direct public sector employees in Scotland is around £500 to £550 million, then the Scottish Government in the short term would need to find around £200 million from its other resources to help, make up the difference. That's another reason why we said that the potential outlook for next year even could be quite difficult if funding is not carried forward. Now, 2 further points. The UK government is only providing funding for, if you like, direct employees of the public sector. It's not providing funding to cover the extra costs for universities, for example, or it's not providing funding to cover the cost of, say, social care providers, a large part of which is outsourced to the private sector or the voluntary sector. So those could be additional costs as well. I think the Scottish Government estimated those could come to another £200 million within Scotland. So there could be some pressures there. But the second point I mentioned is that in the longer term, the OBR assumes based on good evidence, actually, from looking at previous changes elsewhere in the world and in the UK, that a large part of the higher national insurance on employers translates into translates into slower wage growth for employees as the burden is shifted onto employees. So in the longer term, actually, you might see some of those costs that public sector employers are facing in the short term actually get transferred into costs that public sector workers end up paying, given that the public and private sectors are operating, and recruiting from the same labour market in many instances. So in the longer term, actually some of those pressures in terms of the public sector wage bill and employment costs might actually become a little bit less acute over time as lower wages in the private sector as a result of the increase in employer mix allow slightly lower wage increases in the public sector as well. Although, of course, the public sector doesn't have the same ability to change prices, for example, and that'll be less true of, say, some of the lower paying sectors, like, for instance, social care, where you might expect, because many of those are paid at the minimum wage already, there isn't so much scope to kind of hold down wages there, and therefore, for example, the pressure on councils might be more in the longer term than the pressure on, for example, the NHS, where most people are paid substantially above the national living wage, and therefore there might be a bit more scope for wage growth to be a bit lower in future as the burden gets shifted onto workers.
Right, well, that was a very full answer, and it leads on to about another 20, I think, to supplementaries. But so we can pin down 1 or 2 things. I mean, for starters, So are the English departments, like, say, health or education, are they getting fully funded for their national insurance extra costs, or are they also having to find some of that money from within their budgets?
Ben, do you know that?
I don't think we have enough information to say confidently. My understanding from reading the documents is that the intention is to fully compensate those who directly employ public sector workers for the workers they currently employ. But there's the amount of information coming out has been minimal, and I think some UK MPs have been putting in freedom of information requests and getting nothing back. I think that we just don't know to say it with 100% confidence at this stage. But my understanding is the intention is to fully compensate. I could be wrong.
Okay, well, I mean, that's fair enough. If we just don't know at the moment, we'll presumably find out in due course, because it does strike me as quite a big gap between, say, 500 million and 300 million, that's just because Scotland's got a few extra workers. So, you know, my gut feeling is that they're not fully compensating in England, but fair enough, we don't know. And then it's also the case then, I mean, you mentioned a few examples there, like the care sector, but say like GPs, who most people would think of being in the public sector, but am I right in saying that they are definitely not, either in England or Scotland, providing the national insurance for that?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay, so...
And then within Scotland, it would be the choice of the Scottish Government about how it uses the funding it is provided with, whether to compensate on the same basis as England. As I said, you know, I agree with you, actually, the gap was bigger than I would have thought, just because of the difference between, say, a population share versus a share based on Scotland's higher public sector wage bill, although we should wait kind of full details to kind of, you know, draw firm conclusions. But yes, the Scottish Government could provide compensation on the same basis as the UK Government, dipping a bit into its own other funding to do that, or it could choose to provide less or provide more and wider based compensation.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so we've got a choice here, but I suspect it sounds like there's a choice being made down south as well, that if the Department of Health has to also fund GPs, they've also got a challenge with that. You referred to the OBR and the thought that the national insurance increase will push down wages. And I kind of get that within the public sector or places on a fixed budget, but I wasn't sure about the OBR when it came to the private sector, because if you're running a restaurant, which is very expensive, I believe the convener was at one last night, then do you not just put another £1 or £5 or something on the wage, on the price, and it will boost inflation and push prices up?
So looking at this sort of evidence internationally, we did a sort of a big review of this actually for the European Commission a few years ago. The evidence is that actually social security contributions are largely incident on employees. So when you increase social security contributions, it takes some time, but whether the increase is on employers or on employees, that a large part of the burden remains on employees who is shifted to them. Now, that might differ across different sectors. So, for example, it's harder to raise prices if you're in what's called a tradable sector. If you're competing internationally for business, it's harder to raise prices because your employer costs have gone up, because you're competing in an international market where the costs haven't gone up in America or Germany or Japan, so you can't raise your prices. Now, domestically, as you say, if you're a restaurant, well, restaurants in the UK are not really competing that much with restaurants, say, in France and Germany. I don't know how much your convener has to spend on restaurants, but I don't think he's probably travelling to France for a meal. But even though there's more scope to raise prices in the product market, you're also still competing in the same labour market as those international businesses that are kind of trading. So you'd still expect that if actually, say, for example, the amount that the factories can charge doesn't increase, so they do need to kind of, give slower wage increases, that also reduces pressure on restaurants and shops and other things that trade locally to increase wages. So it's the combination of these sort of the different impacts in different markets and the kind of competition in the labour market, which means that actually, even though you think some places can increase prices, some can't, you actually get this ripple effect across the economy, what's called a general equilibrium effect. And And there is uncertainty about exactly how the breakdown will be. Some probably will be in terms of prices, more so for those areas where you can increase prices and not face international competition. Some will be on wages, probably more so in those areas where the types of workers you've got and the types of markets you're selling in are more exposed to international competition. The public sector, probably some combination will be higher costs of public sector employers, but some probably will be lower increases in wages for workers as well. But it's at that bottom end of the labour market where I think you've got national living wage and employer costs going up at the same time. That's where you can see the squeeze. And that could be either sort of potential job losses, or it could mean, costs, I say, for things like social care going up, meaning that, councils could face a real challenge.
Okay, thank you. To move on to something else, you also mentioned the Barnett squeeze in your paper, and I wanted to dig into that just a little bit, because, this year we had the situation for this year's budget that there was a surprisingly large increase for public sector pay in England of, I think, 5.5%, and we get the Barnett consequentials for that. But would I be right in saying that with the Barnett squeeze, we don't really get a proportional share, and therefore we cannot afford, based on that, to give all our workers 5.5%? There's a separate issue that we might have more workers and they might be paid a bit more to start with. But even if they weren't, that 5.5% does not allow us to pay 5.5% here. Is that a fair understanding?
Yeah, so because the Scottish, let's put kind of pay and employment to the side for a moment. Because the Scottish Government's funding per person starts at a higher level, around, I think at the moment it's around 125% of the English level. If you have the same cash per person increase, that is a smaller percentage increase in Scotland. That is basically the definition of the Barnett squeeze. When you start off with a higher level, a given cash increase is a smaller percentage increase, and then over time you would tend to see funding per person in Scotland tend towards the English level. Now, offsetting that is the fact that the Scottish population is growing less quickly, and the Barnett formula doesn't fully account for that. And when we run the kind of scenarios a few years ago, it looked like that funding per person over the long term could fall from about 125% to maybe 115, 117% of the English levels, given the combination of the Barnett squeeze and this slower population growth. Now, it's all very sensitive according to what happens to population growth in the two countries, what happens to inflation, what happens to public sector spending growth. But that's what would happen. And bringing it back to your point, then yes, because spending per head starts higher in Scotland, and a large part of that is a higher public sector workforce and slightly higher public sector pay, a increase that comes from England translates into a smaller increase in percentage terms for Scotland. So yeah, it makes it harder to Scotland to kind of pay for these things without raising taxes itself or cutting other areas of spending. Now, in the long term, this means we think actually it's worth looking at the Barnett formula again, because in the long term, it's not that friendly to Scotland. It's, if you like, served Scotland well historically, but in the long term, it may not. I think the risk in trying to open up this can of worms at the moment is if you were to do a needs assessment, I would be very surprised if it suggested spending needs were 25% higher than in England. So whilst in the long term, Scotland might benefit from Barnett formula reform, in the short term, it might be an unpleasant shock.
That's very well put, thanks. I think that makes it quite clear. And just if I could have asked one point, a kind of relatively minor point in comparison. My understanding is that the UK government is planning to cut back on consultancy quite a lot. And I mean, consultancy is a kind of bad word and people think that it's all a waste of money. But would it not be the case that, consultancy is actually needed because governments both in the UK and Scotland do not have expertise in every single subject. They need to buy in expertise. So is there a danger with cutting back too much in consultancy that you actually lose expertise?
I'll go first, if you like. I think that it's worth thinking about two main reasons I see as why the government would be heavily using consultancy. The first is expertise, as you say, where I think if you're running an IT transformation project, that's the sort of thing you don't do often. You definitely want to buy in. If you're doing something that requires very specialist knowledge, of course, it probably doesn't make sense to try and have that in-house capability. You want to be buying that in. I think the other big reason why you'd use consultancy is for accountability. It's almost like outsourcing the accountability to somebody else, and you can say that, often businesses do this as well. You use consultancy to reach the conclusion that you already knew you wanted to reach, but now you can say that you can blame it on the consultant. So I think there's questions about whether the government is using it for those reasons on occasion also, or whether we just don't have the capacity to do things that the state probably should have capacity to do. Maybe the state should have capacity to deliver major projects, or it should have capacity to do in-depth analysis of what the public think about certain topics, or what the data is suggesting about certain topics. So I think there's a question about state capacity and to what degree we really should be buying in expertise, or whether we should be developing that in-house. And then the question of using consultants to outsource accountability for uncomfortable decisions.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, John. Craig, to be followed by Ross.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I just want to perhaps to jump around a little bit, because I think some of the questions that I was going to ask have already been asked, but there are some follow-ups off the back of it, really just to go to the heart of the sustainability of Scotland's finances and tax system. In your report, you identify that there is a substantial uplift both in year and next year in terms of the block grant, but yet when we speak to the Scottish Government in terms of this year, the additional £1.4 billion that they're set to receive, they say is already now committed, and that of the £3.4 billion for next year, that only around 300 million is actually additional and new money that could be spent on, well, we would say tax cuts. They may have other priorities in the budget. But what does, when you get figures of that quantum, what does it tell you about the underlying health of the public finances, that sums of that amount don't appear to be touching the sides in relation to the government's expenditure?
So I think it was clear that the initial budget set for this year would have been very, very challenging for the Scottish Government to meet. The 2021 spending review was actually also very front-loaded, and whilst there were some top-ups in later years, and actually the Scottish system or situation improved a lot because of improvements in the net tax position, at least forecast net tax position. But even so, the increase in funding in real terms in 24-25 as of the initial budget was very tight. In fact, as I said, it was a 0.6% cut in real terms compared to what was actually spent in 23-24. So it was always clear that without additional funding, very tough choices would need to be made in year. Now, additional funding has come through during this financial year. We saw a top-up in the autumn budget revision of just over, I think, about £1.2 billion for day-to-day spending on public services. And then there's an additional £1.4 billion come through in the UK budget in October. Now, I've also seen the Scottish Government say that this funding is all accounted for. I must say, I'd be a little bit surprised if they had anticipated such a big increase in year. I think it's fair to say, and Ben can kind of come in here maybe as well, that we were actually surprised by the scale of the in-year top-up in 24-25. The UK Government had talked about a 22 billion hole. It had found £6 billion of savings, it said, in year. And I think in the end, it then did a £26 billion top-up. So it was a somewhat larger top-up than we expected. So unless the Scottish Government had been receiving information through informal channels, which I know does sometimes happen from Treasury to the devolved governments to help with their planning, but at least we were surprised by the scale of the top-up. Fraser of Allender Institute have also looked at kind of a number of scenarios for public sector pay growth and use of funding, and they suggest that there could actually be some funding still within this year's budget that could be allocated. And as we say, given the kind of somewhat tighter outlook for subsequent years, it would make sense to kind of bank some of that funding going forwards. Now, coming back a little bit to what Ben said earlier, there could be a bit of a negotiation going on here as well. Because if one says that we're not using all the funding available this year, we're going to carry forward some into next year, and then your initial budget that you kind of put into the budget as presented tomorrow includes that funding, that leaves you a lot less scope for negotiation. And now the Scottish Government is no longer in a sort of agreement with the Greens. It's probably a bit more worried about getting this budget passed. So in terms of sort of budget process management, it might actually make sense to, if you like, at this stage, say that there's less money available this year to carry forward than you might actually expect there to be. And then when you come to the February spring budget revision, actually at that stage say, well, actually we managed to kind of manage down some of these pressures. And then this then gives you some scope to then say, well, actually, you've got a couple of £100 million to play with. Let's negotiate for the budget. So I think actually in the same way as Rachel Reeves, one of the kind of reasons why the envelope can't be tight for later years is that it might allow a stronger negotiating position with departments. Actually, in the Scottish budget position, it might be the case that actually at this stage saying that you're sort of using all this funding this year, here's our plans for next year. If you actually then find out in February you've got a bit more money to play with, that can then be useful in budget negotiations.
Yeah, so I'm kind of reading that there's maybe a bit of kind of smoke and mirrors at play. One thing you do identify, however, is that in future years the Scottish Government is facing quite a challenging situation, partly because of just the projections in relation to public sector pay and the social security bill and potentially also the income tax policies. And you recommend that the Scottish Government set out plans for in a spending review next year to evaluate the key policies that, and to use your words, increasingly differentiate Scotland from the rest of the UK, including higher public sector pay, income tax policies and the wider tax strategy. Are those, and I'd probably add social security into that as well, are those 3 or 4 issues, should they be cause for concern about the long-term sustainability of Scottish public finances?
Well, I think, yes, those are issues where it is certainly worth exploring what the impacts are. So, for example, as John was saying, the higher levels of public sector employment and public sector pay, given the kind of context of the Barnett squeeze, they become more difficult to fund in future years. I think it is, in that sense, worth looking at, actually, has the higher public sector pay awards in recent years in Scotland actually led to, for example, improved recruitment and retention, improved quality, if you like, of workers in the public sector that has then allowed you to, say, increase productivity. It's quite difficult to do that, but actually a combination of, using the data from sort of the various public sector employers, using data on the outputs being achieved, it may be possible to look at actually, what has the impact been of these higher pay by comparing, for example, recruitment and retention, how that's changed in Scotland compared to how that's changed down south in England or in Wales, for example. On the tax side of things, I think it's, as I said, worth, when the new evidence comes in, looking at actually have these increases, particularly in the very top rate of tax, have they actually increased revenues or have they sort of pushed Scotland above the top of the Laffer curve? There'll still be uncertainty, but knowing actually that would be important. And as you say, I think disability benefits, there is an issue to look at there. One thing I mentioned actually is that because it seems that similar changes actually have sort of gone on underneath the radar in England and Wales with the operation of PIP, actually the Scottish reforms may not cost that much additional as was initially expected. We'll find out what the SFC thinks about that tomorrow. But of course, it's still a problem for the UK as a whole if we've got, higher levels across the UK of spending on these benefits, because that reduces room for manoeuvre, on public services at a UK-wide level, which reduces the Scottish Government's funding by the Barnett formula. So I think it is important to look at all of these issues. The other thing I'd say is that the tax strategy, my understanding is that, from rumours going around, it'll be less a strategy for tax policy and more strategy for tax policy making. I think it would be useful if the Scottish Government did set out a bit more of a strategy about how it will reform the wider tax system, in the same way as the UK needs to raise more tax revenues to fund public services with an ageing population. It becomes even more important your tax system is well designed and isn't damaging the economy more than necessary as you're raising more in tax. The same is true for Scotland. And there are things the Scottish Government could do to raise as much as it does now, or even potentially raise more, but in a way that is fairer across households, and less economically damaging. So the tax strategy should be looking towards that as well.
You've slightly preempted my next question. Obviously, you did say in relation to the UK government that you wanted a more coherent tax strategy. Are you looking to the Scottish Government just simply for a tax strategy, coherent or otherwise, at this point in time, therefore?
I mean, I think ideally we would have a coherent tax strategy. I think it would set out, ideally, the broad, not just the kind of broad goals of tax policy, but some concrete steps which will be taken to move tax policy in that direction. And of course, no chancellor or no finance minister wants to write out all their budgets for the next, 3 or 4 years in full detail in advance, particularly where that might lead to behavioural response, forestalling behaviours, or might just become a lobbyist's charter, but actually some sense of direction in terms of actually rethink our tax system can be reformed to make it, more growth friendly by for example, shifting the burden of taxation from income and property transactions more onto property values. That would be potentially, a direction of travel you could go. So yeah, I would like to see something that goes beyond just setting out, if you like, the process by which tax policy will be made and what one could do with more powers from the UK government, and say a bit more about how you think the powers already in Scotland could be used to either raise more in a way that doesn't damage the economy too much, or raise the same amount in a way that is fairer and more efficient.
Thank you. Just briefly, just to close on 2 issues that you identify. Sustainability of the NHS in Scotland, sustainability of Scottish universities and higher education. You said earlier that the inputs into the English health service may be slightly higher than in Scotland, although this year, if you look at the ABR, there was a significant resource increase of £1.1 billion into the Scottish Health Service. If you see the report from Audit Scotland today, it's quite clear that the Scottish Health Service continues to be in crisis and is underperforming the rest of the UK, which would imply that money alone will not solve the NHS's ills. How clear would you be in suggesting that urgent reform is now required to the Scottish NHS, particularly given, I think, a concern that public sector pay and NHS pay is now absorbing a greater proportion of the overall budget?
I think reform is quite a broad term, right, that captures all sorts of things, and could be a huge reorganisation of the service to it could be tweaking some of the financial incentives to different parts of the NHS. I think looking at the Audit Scotland report, it echoes lots of the things that we've found in our own analysis, where direct comparisons of performance between different parts of the UK are hard because things are measured differently and defined slightly differently, and we want to be careful not to be comparing apples and pears. But what it looks as though the NHS in Scotland isn't recovering from the pandemic quite as quickly as the NHS is south of the border. Now, it's not to say that the NHS in England is firing all cylinders and doing fantastically, but it looks as though in Scotland, on lots of measures of hospital waiting times in particular, performance is actually still getting worse and isn't actually improving. And there's this big picture problem of why is it that more resources are going in, not just cash, but real things. There's more staff, more doctors, more nurses, more clinical support staff, but that's not translating into greater volumes of treatment, is a major issue for the health service. It's a major fiscal issue, and it deserves absolute political attention because it's just a huge chunk of what government does. I think that before leaping to grand reforms of how the system is structured, I think that the simplest thing for me is to look at the mix of inputs going into the health service, where frontline staffing has been prioritised, perhaps to the detriment of other areas. I mean, partly that's a function of higher pay awards when we've seen high inflation, but also just a decision to increase the number of frontline staff in the NHS that haven't been matched by increases in capital investment, where I think in Scotland it's actually falling in cash terms year on year at the moment. And if you're not giving those frontline staff the equipment and the buildings and the number of beds and the IT and all the other things that they need to work productively, you're throwing more and more staff into a system that isn't working. I think the analogy that I think works best for me is thinking about a kitchen in a restaurant where if you double the number of chefs, but you keep the number of hobs fixed, you're not going to get twice the number of meals at that lovely restaurant where the convener was eating last night. And so you need to think about the other inputs as well, and not just about the frontline staff. And that productivity question really is at the heart of some of the fiscal challenges in Scotland and in the UK as a whole.
And just finally, in relation to the sustainability and the future of Scottish universities, you identify a heavy reliance within the Scottish higher education system on overseas students, the numbers of which are falling, at the same time where there's been for 15 years no increase in the tuition fees paid for Scottish students, which is leading, I think, to a looming cash crisis within Scottish higher education. What needs to change within the system for it to be put on a more sustainable footing?
So yeah, our report on Scottish HE finds that kind of the amount spent per student for Scottish students is around 22% lower in real terms now than it was as of 2013, with around, well, actually more than half that fall over the last 3 years, given the high rates of inflation. And then looking ahead, you've got the issue of a decline in sort of applications from international students, especially for masters, actually. Applications for undergraduates have held up rather a lot better. But of course, it's master's students where the big increase in numbers and a big increase in income has been seen over the last couple of years. Now, in terms of how to address this, the Scottish Government could increase the amount of resources it provides to Scottish universities through its own funding. It could increase the, if you like, the implicit, tuition fee, increase its teaching grant to Scottish universities, to sort of maintain real terms. Spending on this, it would need, I think, to increase it by around £10 to £20 million a year. We estimate that increasing it to cover the cost of national insurance could be about, I think, pushing around £50 million a year. That's quite small in the context of the overall Scottish budget. So if the Scottish Government wanted to prioritise HE, it could choose to do that. But of course, it comes in the context of many pressures on the Scottish Government's budget. Now, the Scottish Government, in its MTFS, I think last published last year in May, or I think it was May 2023, said that because of the rising pressures on public spending, because of the kind of challenging financial outlook, it would look at the extent to which universal provision was the most effective use of funding versus more targeted use of funds to those that had particular needs or particular affordability issues. Didn't say that in the context of HE specifically, but it said that more generally. I think there is a question about whether the current model of HE financing in Scotland needs to be looked at again if the Scottish Government doesn't feel able to prioritise HE funding within its own budget.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Ross, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks, and good morning, guys. I'd like to, like Craig, I'm going to jump around between a couple of different topics because so many threads that have opened up this morning. The first is just around income tax and the starter basic intermediate rates, and your paper making a perfectly legitimate point saying it would be more progressive to have a 0% rate and then go straight to 21. So the progressivity point, I think, is fair enough, but the other point you make there is around complexity, and that's a word that's beginning to feature quite a lot in commentary around the Scottish income tax system. But I struggle with that a little bit, because ultimately half a dozen bands is still not that many. And I've met plenty of workers on much higher incomes who are interested in what their marginal tax rate is going to be, and are somewhat interested in the relative complexity of having that many bands. I don't know if I've ever met a worker on an average income, so kind of in this range, who is concerned by the apparent complexity of a system that's got half a dozen tax bands. So could you talk me through what the problems are? Complexity is used with negative connotations here. So what are the negative impacts from having a number of different bands?
Yes, so I should say that actually compared to sort of actually many of my colleagues, I'm a little bit less concerned about having additional sort of tax rates, having a 19, 20, 21% rate. It does add a little bit to the complexity of the operation of the system for employers and HMRC, not to a huge extent. my main concern with it was really around, if your aim is to make the tax system more progressive, it is both a little bit more complex and not the best way to make it more progressive. It was, I think, chosen largely, if you like, for political reasons at the point, because at that stage you could say that half of Scottish taxpayers pay less than in the rest of the UK. That was, £20 a year less at that point. Whereas actually, if you'd increased the personal allowance effectively by having a 0% band, you'd see a bigger cut for those with the very lowest incomes, but you wouldn't have seen that, half of Scottish taxpayers number there. Now, it does add a little bit to the kind of complexity of things, for example, like the operation of gift aid. Now, potentially, if there was a single Scottish basic rate of gift aid, of income tax for the basic rate of 21%, you could have a specific Scotland gift aid scheme of 21% relief for charities. Whereas I think at least it was the case that it operated at 20% in Scotland. So some people are basically getting under and some getting over gift aid. So I think it would have some benefits like that. And I think there were also some issues around pensions as well, for certain forms of pensions that perhaps could have been simplified by having just a single rate in Scotland with that level of income. But for me, the main issue was it was not as consistent with the aim of progressivity as this slightly simpler system would have been.
That's really useful. Thanks very much, David. The SFC assumptions around behaviour change, and I think some of your own work is obviously, because we've got very limited evidence here in Scotland so far, based on UK-wide but also international evidence. I'm wondering if you're aware of any significant differences in the international evidence between sub-state and state-level changes in tax policy. The difference between people moving over the border from France to Belgium if France increases their income tax rates versus people moving between cantons in Switzerland. Is there a significant difference in what we see in the behavioural effect, particularly around migration?
Yeah, so when we kind of reviewed this evidence as part of our piece on income tax, it was clear that the degree of migration response in particular does vary across contexts. So, for example, there seems to be quite significant migration responses, between Swiss cantons, people moving, I think, from Zurich to Zug to take account of the lower taxes in Zug. There was a degree of response in Spanish provinces that seemed to be fairly similar to the estimates that HMRC was getting from the figures or data for Scotland for 2018-19. And then in the US, there was sort of a lower degree of migration response on average, although some more recent studies suggests slightly higher responses. But in general, the further you need to move to take account of, to avoid these taxes of migration, you'd expect there to be a lower response because the adjustment costs of doing that are higher the further you need to travel. As well as varying across distances and sort of size of areas that tax policies apply to, there's also quite clear evidence that different types of people are more or less responsive. So some evidence, again, from the US and actually from kind of cross-country variation in the UK, in the EU, suggests that people like inventors, people like footballers are more responsive to things like tax rates than, say, someone working in the public sector as a doctor, highly paid doctor, or so on. And again, that might suggest that if you are kind of, particularly concerned about attracting those more footloose international people that might be inventors and so on, you might care more about this than if you're kind of less concerned about that and are more concerned just about actually, say, retaining public sector workers or those that have a more strong attachment to Scotland in the first place.
Thank you. You've made a number of recommendations, I think SFC have as well, and a number of others around the kind of data that we need to start gathering to really get a good sense of the behavioural impact, payroll, monthly payroll data, things like that. I'd be interested if you could just maybe talk a little bit about how long we would need to gather that for before we would have a robust enough evidence base, but also the impact of the fact that we'd be starting to gather that data now, i.e. years after some of these changes have been made. How do we account for the fact that we will always have that initial period of the income tax changes without that much richer base of data to draw from?
Yeah. So I think one could ask HMRC maybe not to go back as far as 2018-19, but certainly to kind of actually look at, say, the monthly data on PAYE from 23, 24 and 24, 25 to provide that sooner, so you're not waiting until the full self-assessment returns data comes through in, towards the end of next year for 23, 24 and the end of 2026 for 24, 25. So I think we could ask HMRC to sort of bring that data forward for years that have just gone by. I think the other kind of issue one could look at, or the other data one could look at, is bank accounts data. So some banks now are sharing data on expenditures and incomes from bank accounts, anonymized, obviously, with the ONS. One could look at using that data potentially to look at not just employees, but actually the self-employed, so transferring money over from their business accounts into their personal accounts, although that is quite challenging to actually work out what is income and what is sort of transfers for expenses and so on and so forth. So I think actually we could get some data for the last few years of changes, and actually I think that is the most important thing, because the changes since since April 2023, they've been the ones that have really opened up that wedge. Back in 2018-19, I think someone on 125,000 paid, I think, around £1,800 a year more in income tax. You know, not insubstantial, but not that large in the grand scheme of things. By 22-23, it was £2,500. It's now £5,200. So these gaps opened up really in the last couple of years. So I think if we can get data a bit more quickly from HMRC for the last 2 years or so, that would actually help the Scottish Government do some initial analysis, at least, over the next 18 months before the kind of full data comes through.
Two last questions. First is sticking with HMRC and the two of their studies on the potential migrationary behavioural impact from income tax. One of them showed that immediate net negative on migration in 2018-19 for higher earners, but then essentially no effect in 19-20. Then the second one showed a positive inward migration of high earners up to 21-22. So that first one that shows that what appears to be, on first reading, immediate negative behavioural impact in terms of migration for high earners in 18-19. Should we be discounting that, given that you wouldn't expect some behavioural changes happen immediately, but generally not migration, and given everything else that was happening at that point, particularly around Brexit and the fact it didn't reoccur the following year, should we assume that what appears to be an immediate behavioural migrationary impact from the 18-19 tax changes is in fact down to other factors, and that's just kind of probably unrelated to income tax that year, and the longer term studies are maybe a better indicator?
So I can see you've read what I've written there around that point pretty well. So I would not say we should probably discount it. What I would say is that, you know, I was a little bit surprised that the estimates were that all the response happened immediately in the first year of the policy, and that subsequently there weren't impacts in the subsequent year. I think most of the international evidence suggests that migration responses do build up over time, because, you know, it takes a while for the stock of high-income individuals to change, because people don't just move immediately. Their decisions are affected, you know, when an offer comes along for a job in Scotland, which doesn't happen every year, they might be more or less likely to take it up. So I wouldn't want to say, you know, we should probably discount it. But what I would say is I would treat this with not just the sort of the usual heavy pinch of salt given statistical uncertainty, actually maybe, you know, a bigger shovel of salt given this additional issue whereby the effects, you know, aren't in line with what one would expect, given you would expect it to take some time to build up. That's another reason why I would say that actually waiting for information for the 23, 24, 24, 25 changes makes sense before making any radical changes to income tax policy, because they will give much more evidence, given the much bigger tax changes have taken place by that point. The last point I would mention as well is that obviously there was a net flow of higher income taxpayers into Scotland over the period from about 2017 to 2022. We saw a similar trend happen in Wales, and we saw a similar trend, it looks like, happening within England. At least if you look at the kind of net migration figures, they don't have the kind of taxpayer figures specifically there. It looks like this was driven by perhaps kind of a, COVID-related factors where people sort of wanted more space and other things during COVID. I think what you can draw from that is, at least up until March 2022, any behavioural response to Scotland's tax changes was not big enough to offset these other broader changes. Again, it ends in 2022 at the point at which the tax changes start to get much, much bigger. That's, again, why I think that looking at the most recent changes is really important. If actually they suggest that migration responses are not that significant, great, the policy doesn't need to be kind of looked at again. If they confirm the initial estimates, then that comes back to the point that a tax strategy should be one that you're open to revising. And again, I'm sure you would agree with this, that actually when thinking about the tax system, it's not just income tax that can be made more progressive. There are other elements of the tax system, in particular council tax, which are currently highly regressive and less subject to behavioural responses.
Thank you. Conscious of the amount of time taken up, can we get one last question if there's time? Yeah, thank you. On exactly that point, David, of other taxes, just to pick up something that you said, I think it was in response to the convener around LBTT, right? You were somewhat critical there of the impact it's had on people's ability to move, which I think is fair enough, but you singled out the additional dwelling supplement. I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on that, because my assumption is that the rate for the additional dwelling supplement isn't having a negative impact on people's ability to move because they don't live in their holiday home, they live in their primary home, they don't pay ADS on their primary property, or if they're buying another primary residence. But ADS should surely, if set at the right rate, have a positive impact on people's ability to move home, because it's designed not just to raise revenue, but to have a behavioural impact to discourage people from buying holiday homes and therefore freeing up more properties for people to live in as their primary residence.
Yes. So there will be kind of multiple effects of the ADS. So ADS doesn't just apply to holiday homes, it also applies to rental properties as well. And what this will do is, by increasing the cost of a property, both for a second homeowner or a landlord to purchase, it will reduce the amount of properties purchased by them. That might actually slightly reduce the cost for an owner-occupier to purchase that property. So there is that impact there. But also by reducing the ability of landlords to purchase properties, it may lead to a reduction in the supply of rental properties. And in turn, that reduced supply of rental properties might mean an increase in the cost of rental properties. That might make it harder for those that haven't got access, if you like, to the bank of mum and dad to save up for a deposit to purchase a home, even though that cost of the home is a little bit lower. I guess also there is the issue around the overall slightly reduced cost of properties could reduce the overall supply of new properties, given that the return to developers will be slightly lower. So part of this is about an affordability issue. I think another part of this also is about mobility. One of the easiest ways, actually, for someone to move to a new place is to rent a property first. And if the supply of rental properties is lower because of tax penalisation of that, that might actually reduce people's ability to move and take new jobs in new places. So it might act to reduce, if you like, social mobility as people try to move from places where there are fewer jobs to those where there are more jobs. If the rental properties, there's fewer of them there because of the tax treatment of them, that might kind of stop that first run on that social mobility.
Thanks very much. That was all really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, followed by Michelle.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, a couple of quick questions, if I can. The first, taking you back to this year's budget, I think, David, in particular, I think the committee probably has shared a little bit of your confusion about where we've ended up I mean, you identified an additional £2.6 billion in recent sets of consequentials this year, but we are being told by the government that they have assumed that this money was coming. I mean, is there any indication, in your view, as to where we would have ended up if this money hadn't arrived?
So, in the absence of additional top-ups from the UK budget, so 1.2 billion of that funding was found through a combination of money from the UK March budget, from the main estimates, although, as has been said earlier, a large part of that was for the SCAPE costs. And then the Scottish Government has found some money by, cancelling of resource to capital switch, through carrying forward from underspends last year and saying it will draw down more Wind revenues. Already they found, I think, just over £1.2 billion for public services. Without that, we would have been in a really, really difficult situation in Scotland where you would have been needing to see much, much bigger cuts to services outside the health service through which to meet the pressures facing the health service, and also, in terms of, meeting public sector pay bills. With that £1.2 billion, that was enough, I think, to move it from a 0.6% cut in day-to-day spending after inflation to around a 2% increase. That still would have been very, very difficult. Now, with the additional £1.4 billion that's come through during the UK budget, that takes you, I think, to around 6% overall increase in day-to-day spending, and around 5% once you net off those SCAPE figures. That is a really quite substantial increase. It would surprise me if there was no scope to either carry some of that forward or to undo some of the cuts that have already been made. And as I said, because next year you get an additional £1.4 billion, but given some changes in potential income tax forecasts and so on, next year we'll see nowhere near as big an increase year on year as this year will. Carrying forward some of that would probably make sense. But yes, in the absence of these top-ups, the Scottish Government would have been in a situation where it was having to make really quite deep cuts in order to pay for higher public sector pay and pressures in the NHS.
So do you think tomorrow in the budget statement we'll see the Scotland money being put back, for instance? Is that's the kind of measure you're anticipating?
Well, I don't know what we'll see tomorrow. As I was mentioning earlier, one possibility is the Scottish Government waits until the February budget revision, the spring budget revision, to confirm what it will do with the consequentials that came forward for this year. If it does that, we might actually see some really quite tight settlements for the coming year, at least initially in this budget, and then potentially after the February budget revision, and it says that actually we've been able to manage down some pressures, we can actually carry some of this funding forward, it might then use that money to top things up in negotiations over its budget from as it goes through the kind of parliamentary process in February. I don't know, that's just sort of one option. We might also see it confirm that it will be holding some money back, and that then allows it to do some bigger increases year on year next year. The key thing to look at probably will not be the Scottish Government's budget, but the table in the SFC's report, which shows what the Scottish Government's assuming about resource funding this year and resource funding next year, because that often gives a clearer picture of the true year-on-year changes rather than the actual figures in the Scottish Government's budget document.
I mean, what you describe to me is, one, is very opaque in terms of our ability as a committee, but as a parliament, as frankly as members of the public, to try and scrutinise and understand what the government is doing with the money. So, I mean, I go back to the previous year where we had the second of 3 in-year emergency spending reviews, emergency budgets halfway through the year. But then at the end of the year, there was a substantial carryover into the following year, so a significant underspend. So that we're in the situation where we appear to have panics from the government around spending, measures being taken or not being taken. And to illustrate that further, we had evidence from the Minister a few weeks ago who, and around the autumn budget revisions. So there was the 500 million target of cuts that were set in the emergency crisis budget in September. And then we were told that only 180, I believe it was, 188 perhaps, of those savings had actually been made. I mean, it doesn't feel to me, should we be concerned, I suppose is my question, about this ongoing up and down management panic between one budget set in December and what happens in various different fiscal event statements throughout the year, and our ability to understand, and frankly, public services' ability to understand what resources are available to them?
So if I come there first, and I can kind of hand over to Ben for a little bit to kind of say how this is kind of done at the UK level as well. So I think the kind of first thing I'd say is that if you are aware and you plan to actually carry forward money and you know about this as of December, it makes sense at that stage to announce that and then put that money into the budget then so it can be kind of fully scrutinised as part of the kind of like budget process in the Parliament, as opposed to waiting until the spring budget revision or potentially after the spring budget revision, you know, when you get the outturns data down the line. And of course, outturns data traditionally has not been very well publicised in Scotland. But also, it could still be the case that you think you may need the funding. You don't want kind of public sector service providers to be running out of this sort of cash authorisation before the end of the year. But actually, in the end, you do manage to manage down those pressures. So we shouldn't kind of like kick the government if it does. It is able to manage down pressures. What I will say is that the last few years, I think we have seen these, you know, regular emergency budgets. It's not just in Scotland we've seen those. We have also seen those in Wales as well. It is more difficult for the Scottish Government to manage its financial position in year because, of course, the UK Government, if it decides partway through the year that actually we can't manage within this, it can just decide to borrow more. The Scottish Government at the moment can't do that. There is only borrowing for forecast errors. We have said in a review of the fiscal framework that there probably should be some small amount of borrowing for pressures on public service spending, as well as forecast errors on taxes and social security. So the Scottish Government does have, you know, less room for manoeuvre. But I think that the last year in particular has seen an issue where, if you like, the assumptions being made around public sector pay, there was quite a big difference between what the SFC was saying and what the Scottish Government had implicitly assumed. And we have seen, if you like, this sort of regular pattern now start to emerge, to some extent in Wales, but I say more so in Scotland, of having to sort of, you know, cut back during the course of the year to free up money for the NHS and public sector pay. Down the line. The Welsh Government actually started to maybe learn the lesson of this a little bit. It did that, I think, in 22-23 and 22-24, but in the 24-25 budget, it set a much, much tighter settlement for areas outside the NHS so that it could actually preempt these pressures and put that money in the first place, which then meant it hasn't had to do the same emergency budget measures this year as it has in previous years.
Can I illustrate, perhaps, so we're talking about the kind of at the macro level in terms of how the government's managing that budget, but I'm thinking about the impact of this kind of up and down, you know, backwards and forwards approach that the government is taking on public services. And if I can illustrate that, NHS Tayside, where I live and the region that I represent, were telling myself and colleagues just at the end of last week that they were, at the start of the year, they were set a deficit cap of £37 million. A few months ago, they told MSPs that they were going to manage about £20 million of the deficit. And then, so they go through this process about trying and understand how they can save money. And then, lo and behold, at the start of November, unsurprisingly, frankly, after the UK budget, the Scottish Government agrees, no, you can go full hell for leather and have the £37 million approach. I mean, do you not think that this up and down approach, not only is that not driving efficiency and having responsible management, but it's actually, there's real cost in that, isn't there, in terms of the way that public services are managed?
Ben, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I'll have some thoughts on that one. I do agree. I think that having the degree of certainty to know if you hire someone that you're going to have the budget there to pay for them next year, that if you invest in a multi-year project that the funding will be there to see it through, all of that is massively important and adds to efficiency. I guess it's just this trade-off that you're having to make within the Treasury or within the Scottish Government about trading off like certainty against flexibility. And I think the last few years have just been particularly hard in the sense of expecting when plans were set in 2021 at the UK government spending review, which largely governed what happened in the interim. We were expecting inflation at a little bit above the 2% target, but thereabouts, public sector pay awards maybe in the 2.5–3% zone. And things just turned out very, very differently. And so there's been subsequent changes and plans adapted in response to changing circumstances. They could have stuck exactly to those plans that had been set out and rigidly adhered to those, but I think that would have had incredibly damaging impacts. And so it's just quite hard to strike that balance. In a more predictable world, perhaps you could be better at sticking to budgets, not doing the back and forwards and messing with those managers' ability to plan in the NHS as you were referencing. I think that there's sometimes almost like a chicken and egg problem, but there's a reluctance perhaps to offer a more generous settlement to services and say, here's your budget, go live within it, because the Treasury in Westminster has particularly learned that departments have a tendency to come back and ask for more whatever you give them, and so they deliberately lowball it and then give themselves space to top it up later, but then you end up with hitting efficiency later on. It'd be much better if we could shift to a new higher trust, more stable equilibrium, but I think it's very hard to just make that jump immediately.
Okay. Just finally then on the NHS report that IFS issued recently. I mean, we've got headlines in Scotland this morning from the Auditor General with sounding real alarm bells in terms of and I think it chimes very closely in many regards with the analysis that you've provided to us. But is this overall management, as I've described, of the finances not part of the problem? I mean, it's given and you've described the significant uplift in finance this year, is now not the moment to try and actually find a new direction and to try and change and reform services rather than doing it when spending is decreasing or there's a huge amount of panic? Is now not the time to actually try and change direction?
Yes, I think it is. I think that it's much easier to rebalance between services or between different pots within the overall whole when funding is going up. So to give just one example where I think attention should be paid, it's easier if you think that really important to boosting productivity within hospitals is investing in the physical side of things. It's beds, it's new equipment, it's particularly IT, data infrastructure. It's much harder to prioritise that stuff if doing so is going to mean cutting frontline staff or cutting pay bill. If funding is going up overall, you can hold the pay bill more or less flat or increase it slightly, but increase capital investment by much more. So it's much easier to do that rebalancing. Similarly, if you talk about trying to shift care from hospitals into community or shift away from treating illness and more towards prevention, those things are easier when a rising tide is lifting all boats and you can push resources into priority areas. I do worry a lot in Scotland and in the UK as a whole about there are clear targets and a desire to have more nurses, to have more doctors, to have more NHS clinical staff. But there's a real risk that doing that will squeeze out the ability to invest in those other things, and you will end up in a downward spiral where adding more and more staff isn't you don't get as much bang for your buck as you should because they're not being equipped with. We haven't got more beds to treat more patients. We haven't got the investments in data infrastructure to share data between different bits of the system, those sorts of things that you really need to be doing alongside. So I think that the evidence is clear that the recovery in the NHS is stalling in Scotland, and I think that might require a change of approach. Now is the time to try and jolt out of that and try to make up some of the lost ground.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Michelle?
Good morning. I've got a sort of mix of questions as well, given that we're nearly at the end of the session. Firstly, I want to sort of start almost at the beginning. You've been quite critical about the extent to which you really see this as a budget for growth, and indeed you've also quoted the OBR in suggesting that it will eventually boost output in a sustainable way from 2032, and we've also heard commentary about the front loading. Given that wider context of really limited growth, and of course Brexit's in the room as well, and the limitations of the Scottish Government, of which, David, you obviously are an expert, having done the work in the fiscal framework, in what ways do you think that the Scottish Government can really focus on making their budget one for growth?
Shall I start, David, and then you can come in, perhaps?
Yeah.
I think if you're looking at the UK budget from about 6 weeks ago, whatever it was, it's worth distinguishing between the short term and the long term, where I think there was a quite commendable focus in a way on doing things that might not yield results over a single parliamentary timetable. Often when finance ministers are presented with tough decisions, the first thing to go is cancel the road projects or cancel the investment programme that people won't notice because it hasn't started yet. And I think actually in a difficult fiscal context, prioritising investment is something that we hope, if spent well, should pay off in the long term. And in the short term, it injects some extra demand into the economy. It's almost like a sugar rush in a way in the short term, but then the sustainable growth impacts will come further down the line, you would hope, from spending well on infrastructure projects and the like. I think that what was lacking is the other parts of a coherent growth agenda, where it's just there are no right answers here. If there were simple things levers that governments could pull that just boost growth, we'd probably already be doing them, particularly if they were politically easy. I think that some of the difficult stuff is around making it things about planning and making it easier to build. There's a sort of a growing movement calling for that as being the key to unlocking all of the UK's problems. But I think there's other issues around regional imbalances, around our transport infrastructure in certain bits of the UK, in terms of skills and supporting our growth sectors, such as they are in the areas where the UK does genuinely have a world-leading comparative advantage. And so, I mean, I'll now pass the difficult bit to David to say what this means for Scotland, but I think that I think that the UK government hasn't got much beyond more investment and a bit more stability, and maybe we'll build some more houses. I think we're going to have to go beyond that if we really want to shake the UK out of its slump. Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, in terms of Scotland specifically, I think some of the kind of things that the UK government is doing at a national level could be considered in Scotland. So, there's scope for Scotland potentially to reform its planning system and to make that a bit more kind of growth friendly. There are issues around education and skills. So Scotland has seen its kind of rankings in international sort of attainment for kind of school children sort of fall over time. A focus on kind of trying to kind of stop that and improve, particularly where Scotland's actually seen its position fall. It's not at the kind of lower tail of attainment. Actually, it's been doing relatively well in kind of keeping kind of the lower tail of attainment up towards international standards, but it's seen a decline at the higher end. And of course, it's the higher end which might be kind of those students that go on to work in sort of the industries of tomorrow, in many cases around AI and so on. So looking at education and kind of how do you kind of stretch those most able pupils. I think I've come back to the tax strategy. The tax strategy, I think, probably will have a focus on growth in there, but actually thinking about not just kind of how can growth help ease the challenges on the tax system, but also how can the tax system help boost growth. And I think they said looking at kind of the design of Scotland's property tax system, which, like the system in the UK as a whole, isn't doing as much as it can to support growth and is actively reducing the ability of people to move to get better accommodation or to take jobs up. So I think there are a number of things the Scottish Government could do. You mentioned the fiscal framework there as well. I think there are things the fiscal framework could be changing in some ways to kind of provide the Scottish Government with a little bit more flexibility in terms of its budget. I don't think that would be, the big answer in terms of growth, but it might avoid a little bit or reduce the extent to which you need quite as many kind of short-term changes within year that Michael was mentioning.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask about the fiscal framework. Obviously, you had quite a key role in it, and in the light of what you know now, I mean, you did raise some concerns at the time in terms of limits, and you noted that rather than linking the limits to inflation, it would make more sense to link them to the amounts of revenue and social security spending at risk, which will typically grow faster than inflation. So with the benefit of hindsight, what further recommendations might you have made, and do you still stand by what you said at the time?
So yeah, I completely stand by what we said when we kind of reviewed the fiscal framework, update. Myself, David Bell and David Isa were involved in a kind of a report looking at the block grant adjustments specifically. I think that the kind of agreement on the block grant adjustments to continue with the index per capita method was a pragmatic recognition of the status quo and kind of balances, if you like, the different competing objectives of the Smith Commission in a way that, probably makes sense for both governments. They can both live with it. On the borrowing side, I think it was a step in the right direction, but as you said, both in terms of income tax revenues in particular and Social Security, because of real terms growth in revenues are luckily still growing faster than inflation. And on the spending side, disability benefit spending in particular is growing substantially faster than inflation, indexing to the forecast growth of those revenues and spending items in the rest of the UK probably would have made sense rather than inflation. And so the other area I think is at the moment the Scottish Government has borrowing powers just for forecast errors for Social Security and taxes. But we see that pressures can hit budgets for other reasons. It could be an increase in the cost of public services that was unexpected. It could be a fall in income tax revenues or an increase in Social Security costs that's forecast in advance, but is still a kind of temporary hit to revenues or temporary boost to spending. Actually, we recommended giving the Scottish Government the power to borrow perhaps 1% to 2% of its budget to cover those forecast in advance changes or those public service pressures as well. Given that there's no England-only borrowing, we don't think we could recommend giving Scotland full borrowing powers because at the moment, any UK borrowing is either for UK-wide things like the pension or leads to Barnett consequences for Scotland. So if Scotland had fully had full borrowing powers, there'd be an imbalance actually in the system against England. But given that the Scottish Government has to manage a large and a more demand-led budget now than in the past, some additional flexibilities would make sense and wouldn't put either fairness or the fiscal sustainability of the UK at risk. Yeah,
and you made a fair comment about demand-led and the implications of that. A third wee point that came up earlier in the session, I think it was my colleague Liz Smith asked about data. One of the areas where I've asked questions before is having Scotland-specific data, or rather the lack of Scotland-specific data. I'm thinking in particular around inflation. I mean, obviously, we've got a lot of interesting geopolitics going on now that could impact oil and gas. Scotland's economy has more of a reliance on that. We've got national insurance contributions that could affect interest rates going forward. I'm just interested in testing your appetite of where you think advances could be made from all the relevant institutions to start to collect Scotland-specific data.
So I think we should first recognise the kind of significant progress that's been made on Scotland-specific economic data over the last few years by the work of the Scottish Government's sort of economic division that has led to a significant improvement in the data sort of collected on the Scottish economy. Now, one area you mentioned there is inflation. There is no Scotland-specific inflation figures at the moment. In the past, the ONS has collected information on price levels in different parts of the UK. We've used them ourselves previously to look at poverty rates and incomes adjusted for the differences in cost of living across the UK. But it did that on a sort of ad hoc basis. So one option would be to collect that on a more ongoing basis. That could either potentially be done by the ONS, or perhaps the Scottish Government could add that to its economic division. I think kind of my expectation would be that whilst the price level differs in Scotland somewhat, the inflation rates year on year would be pretty similar. Spending patterns are quite similar across Scotland and the rest of the UK, and the drivers of increases in costs would be very similar as well. The one area I think where the Scottish Government might choose to invest a bit more in potentially is adding booster samples to various surveys. The Scottish Government does pay for boosters to certain surveys to get an enhanced sample size for Scotland. I'm thinking one could perhaps do that for the labour force survey, or could pay for an increase in the size of the family resources survey in Scotland again. Particularly with the Scottish Government's focus on child poverty, it's actually quite difficult to using the sample sizes available in the family resources survey to fully work out what's going on with the Scottish child poverty rates. Some investment there, given how much the Scottish Government now is investing in trying to tackle child poverty, some investment in the data collection there might make sense.
Yeah, and it's that boosting the Scottish sample size is something I'd taken up directly with the ONS myself. Last sort of random question, which I tend to ask every year, that, I mean, I'm not up to date with the latest statistics, but certainly we know that corruption...
Give me evidence of the Scottish Parliament. Could you give me 2 minutes?
I'm just giving Ben a minute. So we know that the cost of corruption has a fairly significant impact on UK GDP. I mean, the latest figures, I'm not up to date, but I know certainly 3 years ago a figure of around 262 billion each and every year was being touted by money laundering and so on. But I just wondered where your thinking was in that, given that, I mean, it was quite a while ago, but at the start of this year, the UK dropped down again once more in the Transparency Task Force corruption index, but it continues to be a significant amount off of UK GDP. And I think I might have asked you about this either last year, David, or the year before, to what extent you took account of the cost of corruption given the very constrained public finances. Have you got any further thoughts on that?
Ben, do you have any thoughts on that? And I might then come back with kind of a last point on it.
Nothing immediate springs to mind.
No, it's not an area we've looked at in great depth. I mean, I think what I'd say here is that clearly, obviously, corruption, tax evasion, tax avoidance, things like that, they do impose costs. The optimal level of corruption, the optimal level of tax avoidance and tax evasion, unfortunately, is not zero, though, because actions one takes to tackle those things sometimes do impose costs also on the economy. So, for example, through the rules and regulations, through the paperwork that one needs to kind of, fill in to get a paper trail to help, say, improve and tackle tax avoidance, tax evasion. So I'm just saying this to kind of make the sort of, fairly uncontroversial point that when looking at kind of investments to, say, tackle corruption, to tackle tax avoidance, tax evasion, one needs to look both at the benefits of that, and there are real benefits in reducing these harmful behaviours, but also sometimes the potential costs. That's the same whether you're trying to tackle tax avoidance by HMRC or tackle corruption by organised crime. One needs to make sure that when trying to tackle these real significant problems, we're not also imposing very, very large costs on legitimate economic activity and legitimate taxpayers as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I think we've struggled to get to £262 billion. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our witnesses this morning. We've gone well over time, and I'm afraid that I realise that you have another meeting to go to, and indeed so do colleagues around this table. So I bring the session to an end, and thank you very much for your contributions today. The Scottish Budget will be published tomorrow, 4th of December, and the committee will take evidence on the Scottish Government's tax and spending plans. At future meetings in December and January, all colleagues have been given details of the budget timeline. So thank you very much. And as that was the only item on our agenda today, I now close the meeting. Thank you, everyone.